Hey up and welcome to the Strategy Sessions. My name's Andy Jarvis. I'm the founder of SEO Marketing, a marketing strategy consultancy based in Belfast and Liverpool. I'm also the host of this podcast. Welcome and thank you for coming along to the show. We're going to be talking today about courses and, well, lots of other things as well. But today's guest is Tom Critchlow. Tom is a marketing consultant, a strategy consultant, and a man whose words I like to read. He writes an amazing blog, link in the show notes, about what it's like being an independent consultant. And he's also created an online course, the SEO MBA. It's not about the how do you build more links. It's not about how to do the tactical bit of SEO. It's about to do, I think, probably what you'd call the soft skills, even though in the show we both talk about why we hate the phrase soft skills. But it's about the soft skills that go around SEO and how to influence at board level. Really important course. And if you've met any SEOs, as I have, hello everybody, you're all lovely people, you would probably say there's a little bit of a gap sometimes with explaining what SEO is and what it does and taking that up to a board level where people need to be interested if you need the budget to be able to do it well. While we're talking courses, and just before we get on with the interview with Tom, it would be remiss of me not to mention the digital marketing strategy course that I have with the University of Vaasa. Again, link in the show notes. It's $249, which is an absolute steal to basically be walked through a process to create a digital marketing strategy for your organization. Plot twist, there's another course coming soon which focuses a little bit on social media strategy and how you do that, but more about that once that course is ready and live. But before then, let's get into the interview with Tom. I spoke to Tom the other day when he was in his Brooklyn apartment, and this is what the interview went like. Tom, welcome to the Strategy Sessions. Thank you for joining me. How are things today?
I'm good. Yeah, it's a nice sunny morning here in Brooklyn, New York. Thanks for having me on.
Wonderful. Now, that isn't a Brooklyn accent, though, so you're not a native of New York State.
No, I grew up in Yorkshire. I grew up in Harrogate, lived there most of my childhood, and then went to university at Warwick, lived in London for a bit, and then I've been in Brooklyn for about a decade.
So take us through a little bit of the career background then, because I think there's probably an interesting story there of how you landed in Brooklyn and the sort of consulting work that you do now.
Yeah, sure. So I kind of cut my teeth, I guess, in the SEO industry. My brother, Will Critchlow, founded an agency called Distilled. And
not that Will Critchlow.
Yeah, that Will Critchlow. Yeah. I'm the better Critchlow of the two.
Agreed.
Yeah. So he started the agency. This is back in like 2008, I want to say, something like that. And at that time, I was kind of just early kind of first steps in my career, figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. I thought about being a professional poker player for a little bit and some other, dubious decisions. But eventually, Will was like, "Hey, come join my agency. We could do some SEO stuff." And so we kind of got into SEO at the right time at the right place when SEO was becoming a thing, certainly in the UK. And so Distilled kind of became this agency who had this lovely positioning of being like, well, we're the only people who actually think about SEO, right? There were SEO agencies or agencies that did SEO, but it was all cookie cutter and it was all outsourcing stuff, to offshore teams, teams that didn't even speak English, rewriting title tags and all kinds of, strange behaviors, because SEO was just not really a strategic activity. Nobody was really investing in it properly. And so we became this agency that was like, oh, if you really want to care about it, if you want to do it properly, go to these folks. And so we were at the right time at the right place, but it still took off. The SEO industry took off, and we grew that agency pretty well. And then I actually told my brother, I was like, I think I want to quit. I was running the SEO team at Distilled. We had maybe 20, 30 people in London. And I said, I've been doing this for a while. I think I want to quit. And he was like, well, how about instead of quitting, you got to open our New York office? Because I think he sensed it was like, I was kind of young and, had no life commitments. And he was like, what you really mean here is you want to change, right? And I was like, that sounds exactly what I want. Yeah, great. Go live in New York. Why not? So I moved to New York in 2011 and opened the Distilled office over here, hired a team, got the business off the ground, and so on. And that was really fun, interesting. Fell in love with Brooklyn and New York in particular, and then went to work at Google for a couple of years. So I worked at Google Creative Lab here in New York, and that was very much a deliberate step outside of the SEO industry. The SEO industry is very narrow, I think, and in particular at that time, 2011, 2012, having gone from London, where digital was kind of like emerging and burgeoning, to like landing in New York, where digital was like, seemed like at the time, everything, right? Digital was this like huge growth, and everyone was talking about digital, everyone was talking about startups. And so it was a kind of really exciting time. And I thought, I want to do something which is a little bit more than just SEO. So I maybe went too far in the other direction. I went all the way over to kind of brand marketing, creative marketing, innovation work at this team at Google, where I worked on, TV ads and, concept videos and all kinds of stuff like that I honestly had very little experience doing. I was a little bit like a fish out of water doing that stuff, but it was a good learning experience. And then I did that for a couple of years. And then for the last 7 years now, I've been out on my own as an independent consultant. And I'd say that my work is kind of this interesting mixture of marketing strategy, content strategy, and sometimes SEO. But all of that is kind of through the lens of what I call kind of business strategy, and really just helping organizations do new things. So often the pain point and the kind of touch point the customers come to me with, or clients come to me with, is saying, hey, we want to do this new thing, whether it's doing marketing for the first time, whether it's doing SEO for the first time, whether it's pushing into a new direction, opening a new business unit, whatever. And I'll come in and do a mixture of setting the strategy, which is some classical, put a PowerPoint deck together, blah blah blah. But then I also stick around and actually hire a team, put processes in place, do the kind of the organizational work to actually get that thing off the ground and get it running and get it working. And that work often takes much longer, right? So I found this nice cadence of, yes, the strategy work, but then I'll work with these clients for 1, 2, 3+ years, getting this initiative off the ground, making sure they're doing it the right way, making sure that they can really do it themselves. Because that is, I think a lot of strategy work falls short there, where it sounds nice and it has nice ideas in it. But if you've ever worked with an organization trying to get them to do something they've never done before, it just is, A, it's hard, and B, it takes forever, right, for them to build the muscle, to figure out how to invest in it, to figure out why it's important, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of where I am today, doing this kind of weird hybrid mixture of, marketing strategy, consulting, content strategy, almost like org design at times, hiring processes, et cetera.
If you're watching the video on the YouTube channel, you'll notice my neck is quite sore now from nodding along in agreement with Tom for some of those last bits there. Certainly the getting organizations to stick. And we've talked recently, for regular listeners anyway, on some of the other podcasts with JP Castlin and Aris Stamatis, particularly those two guys, about the link between strategy and execution. And I think when you talk to modern strategists, for risk of sounding like my grandmother, we're very much concerned with making sure execution happens. I think classic strategists, and it's a very ugly demarcation, and it's like, here is this wonderful document, you must read this and be impressed by its grandeur and smartness, go off and sort it out, and off they waltz out of the door. But if you don't have strategy and execution together, you've just got a very expensive wedge of paper, right? And that's probably the gap in most places, is taking that strategy and bringing it to life.
Totally.
Yeah.
I read probably one of the most formative things I read in my career has been from the Helsinki Design Lab. I'm not sure if you're familiar with those folks, but it's like a small innovation unit in Helsinki, and they were funded by the government. And specifically, they had this approach that they called strategy and stewardship. And okay. the terminology and the theory that they had around it, which is basically what we just described, which is the strategy informs the execution, right? But if you call it execution, you think about it as just doing work, then you're going to undervalue the kind of the day-to-day learnings and iteration and kind of in the weeds, how valuable it is to be in the weeds doing it and learning and getting feedback. And so calling it strategy and stewardship, even though it's just a language change, is actually a perspective change to say you need the strategy, but then you need to be in the weeds, you need to find the learnings, you need to be, doing the work so that you can then reformulate the strategy, iterate on the strategy, come back, change direction, etc. And I have this great kind of mental model of, if you only do the strategy work and you let the client go and do the execution work themselves, you're not going to get invited back to the room 9 months, 12 months later to reset the strategy. And if you are, you're going to say the same things you said last time, because you haven't got any new insights, right? Whereas I really like the idea of looking at the execution work, the day-to-day work, as informing directly the future strategy, right? You're in there, you're learning, you're figuring out how it actually works, you're getting that kind of tactile experience and hands-on. You got a hands in the clay, right? You're kind of like you're getting yourself dirty, yep. And that's all stuff that then dictates the future strategy, right? And I think we've all been there. In fact, I think you just had a LinkedIn post, I think, that you posted maybe a couple of days ago about this idea of like strategy isn't sexy, or good strategy isn't sexy. It's pretty straightforward. And I find that that's also the case with most strategies that I put together, where no matter how much I tell myself that it should be simple, you always overreach a little bit. And when you get in the weeds, you're always like, you know what, actually the strategy is just doing this one thing. Like I thought it was like 5 things, and I tried to narrow, but like it's really just this one thing. But getting that one thing and doing it right, and getting all the processes in place, and getting all the stakeholders bought in and aligned and so on and so forth, is certainly not straightforward. But I think that's the, anyway, I'm kind of rambling now, but this book from the Helsinki Design Lab that we'll put in the show notes, but it really informed my thinking of just how valuable it is to stick around and not just do the strategy piece.
So having said I'd never heard of them, as soon as when you said strategy and stewardship, I was like, hold on, I do know this because you've written about it, or it's been mentioned in one of your blog posts. So we'll come back to that in 1 second, but just back to my LinkedIn post for a second. I think you're right. I wrote about it being, when you present the strategy, I got 2 comments in a week of, oh, of course, that's what we should be doing. And you're like, when I was younger, that would have been, I'd have taken that as a criticism. Like, it wasn't innovative enough. It wasn't this left field idea that would radically change the business. But they're not being brave to kind of narrow it down to those things. But the difficulty is picking which of those dozens of things that you could really spend your time and effort on is the one thing. And I think previously I would have, handed over 10 recommendations of 10 things that needed doing, walked out of the door, and then none of them would have happened. And you go back a year later and like, oh, we haven't really moved on. Let's do this one thing. Let's be the best at it we can be. And then next year we can do something else. Now, as you get to bigger organizations, they often try and do 3, 4, 5 things at once, but you never really get, I don't think I've ever seen an organization properly do more than 3 things in a year. 3 big things anyway.
That's true. Yeah.
I'm trying to think if there's any exceptions to that rule, but not that I can immediately think of. So yeah, the simplicity in strategy is, and I don't like the word simplicity because people hear the simple bit of it and just think, oh, that must be easy. And go, it's not easy, is it? But it is simple. I think that's getting the language right is important, isn't it? That's the thing I think I'm saying. We have to get the language right as strategists. Right.
And I think the other frame to that was also, so I think there's a piece of this which is that it's valuable for clients to do strategy and stewardship. But what was most useful in certain ways was kind of the internal reflection for me as I got more senior and as I started to charge clients more money, I didn't want to do the execution work, right? Because I somehow felt like that would devalue my work or demean my time or like make me less senior. And what was fascinating about this strategy and stewardship concept was it really hammered home this idea that sticking around for the implementation, doing the stewardship of the strategy is deeply valuable. And you can do that as a senior individual. You can do that with bringing a lot of experience to bear, right? And actually, when I look back now, so I just went through an exercise getting a bunch of testimonials from old clients. And one of the recurring themes that kept popping up was this idea of like, clients would say things like, oh, Tom does a strategy, but then it was really great that he rolled up his sleeves and did the work that needed doing. It's like, this is a real value point for clients. And in my work, I charge the same day rate for the strategy work and the stewardship, right? If you want my time, it's my time. And so I've kind of come to terms with that, but that concept really just like, it brought me at peace with sticking around and doing execution work, even though it might be at times, below my pay grade, whatever that means. But it also kind of emphasized this idea that I should be working with clients for a long period of time, right? And retained revenue is just a kind of magic force for any kind of agency or consultant. So anyway, it was a very impactful concept for me.
And pricing is easily the most difficult part of what I do. I've come to terms with a day rate that I'm comfortable with, but I don't actually like quoting a day rate often with clients. I look at the scope of the project. Now in my mind, I think there's maybe X number of days, but I'll then scope the project and quote them a fixed price certainly for the strategy work anyway. And if I can do the work in half the time, wonderful. If it takes twice the time, then I just need to learn to price better. But once you get into, will you do a day a week or 3 days a month, then it is very much on a day rate basis. And I find it really awkward, because it's like, here's the price of the day rate then. You can't obfuscate it. I can't even say that word. You can't hide it then. It's easier. It's stuck in my teeth. And that's a difficult thing to get used to, isn't it? To get used to that way of going, yep, this is the price, and then shutting up and letting them speak next. That's a really difficult place to get to.
Yeah, having the confidence to charge what seems like an absurd number like, this is just a really big number. Why can I justify that? Is that me? Like, is this worth it? Am I going to be valuable every single day I work for them? Right, every single hour, am I going to be delivering this much value? Pricing is a real psychological minefield, if nothing else. Certainly for independent workers, right? I think agency, like once you build a kind of a company name around you or an agency name, you can hide. It's a little bit more. Well, the company is charging me this, and I happen to be delivering the work. But as an independent consultant, that distinction is usually very, very razor thin, if it's even there at all, right? And so I think there's a real psychological game of getting comfortable in your own skin, getting comfortable commanding those rates. And like you said, getting comfortable putting those rates out there and then shutting up, rather than putting those rates out there and instantly being like, well, if that's too high, we could probably, it's like, and I still find myself wanting to do that. Every time I talk to a client, I'm like, here's my day rate. But for you, like
jumping in. The best bit of sales advice I ever got, and I'm hopeless at it as well, but it was that once you present the price document, shut up, because the first person to speak after that document is on the table is the one who loses, for want of a better phrase. Just put it down there and go, so that's the rates. And that half a second delay before they say okay or ooh feels like 3 days usually. You just sat there going, why is it so quiet in here?
Right.
What's going on? Say something, right. say something. So I easily the most difficult part of the job for me is doing that. But I'm getting better, I think. I hope.
One of the things that I found as an independent, certainly, that's been really helpful is surrounding myself with a little community and network of other independents and having very transparent conversations with them and saying, hey, what do you charge? Hey, I'm doing this kind of work. What would you charge a client for this? There's a lot of relief. There's a ton of kind of like, okay, like to know that you're not the only one charging those rates, right? To be like, this is actually what my friend charges, or like, somebody else would charge the same amount, like that. It just gives you some data point to reassure yourself that you're not being crazy. And it's also just good practice to kind of benchmark against the industry, because that also helps you understand what clients might be seeing elsewhere, or what they might be hearing from other people they're talking to. But more importantly, I think, is that just the psychology of okay, I can have confidence using this number.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you touched on something there, which is something I do. So there's three of us. There's myself and Danielle and Ben. We all used to work together 15, 12, 15, some time ago. And we all do sort of independent marketing services in one way or another. And we have what I refer to as like a little board meeting once a month, because we're trying to run businesses. I think 5 people is the most that any of us have working for us. And trying to run a business on your own, bouncing around your own head, trying to solve the same problems that other people are trying to solve. So we have these board meetings where we sit and discuss with each other problems that we've got. And you can be really, really open and honest, because we're friends, we know each other, they talk about hiring problems and finance problems and clients who aren't paying on time and all that sort of stuff. And one of the reasons I mention this is that I started reading your blog, which we will give a big up to, one of your blogs anyway, about how you manage time when you're doing this sort of strategy piece, when you're on kind of value time, but then you get into working on clock time. So Chronos and Kairos, I think, was the terminology, the Greek terminology for it. And I sent that to one of the people in the group. I was like, I think this is where you're feeling some of the pressure of, value and clock time and the two things being differently. So tell us what got you into writing the blog in the first place. And then if you want to explain that blog in a little bit more detail, and obviously there's a link in the show notes, go and read it. It's brilliant. Yeah,
well, I appreciate the kind words. It's warms my heart anytime I hear real humans kind of reading my stuff, which is great. I think this idea really dates all the way back to when I first got into the SEO industry. And there was this, it still is, to be fair, to this day, but certainly back then there was this huge kind of standardization in the industry. And it was like, okay, client comes to you, says we want to do SEO, and the agency says, great, we're going to do a technical audit, and we're going to do keyword research, and we're going to do a link building audit, and we're going to do a content strategy. And each of those documents is going to take 2 to 3 weeks. So by the end of 4, 8, 12 weeks, we'll have done the strategy, and then we can move on from there. And these documents would just sit on the shelf. There were documents that were created that had almost no value, right? At best, each one of them would have like a single useful nugget in that the client could actually use or actually do something with. And it was just this massive time waste, right? And it was kind of like, if you think about driving to value, like what is the quickest time to value that we can get, there's just far more efficient ways of doing it than waiting for 8-12 weeks to do like documents. And so the SEO industry in particular was trained that certain way. And so at Distilled, we really tried to push back on that, and we kind of created more of a consulting mindset of like, we're going to listen to whatever your specific needs are when you come in the door, and we're going to try and work on those things on day one, right? So if we think we're going to start creating content, let's talk to the writers on day one. Let's try and figure out a content strategy that we can put live in a number of weeks rather than a number of months. And so that mindset and that philosophy really carried all the way through to my consulting work today. And certainly as an independent consultant, what I realized was when clients will push this kind of standardization of time on you, right? They will push deliverables onto you as kind of work units, where they're like, I think I want some help with my content. And so Tom, can you do a content strategy for me? And so if you say yes to that, you're basically signing up to this like deliverable, right? You're like, oh, I have to put a presentation together or a document together or some big quote unquote content strategy, right? It has to cover off all these, it has to be comprehensive, it has to have a start and a middle and an end, and it has to have all these things. But what they wanted was help with their content, right? And help with their content is both an ongoing thing and also a thing that you can get started with kind of today, right? It's like, well, let me speak to the people making content and let me see what the issues are, and then we'll go from there. And the kind of iterative approach, like we talked about with strategy and stewardship, right? This idea of it isn't about doing a big strategy and then letting it sit on the table. It's about a lighter weight strategy and then an ongoing stewardship and refinement and iteration and so on. So what this post, this Kronos and Kairos, was specifically about basically saying, on the one hand, clients will ask for time units, right? That's for deliverables, right? Which they think they want. And there's two really big things that happen off it. One is it's not actually what they want value. But two, when you're a solo consultant, right? You don't have a team behind you. If you sign yourself up for too many of those deliverables, your time is going to vanish, right? Like you're going to end up in this kind of time crunch where you have like deadlines and you have these big blocks of work that you need to try and get done, these big documents. And what I realized is you can kind of skirt around all of this with this kind of Kairos approach, right? So Kairos, you kind of think of like just in time consulting, right? Or kind of, not clock time, but narrative time. And so what I try and do is I try and get to that time to value as quickly as I can. And I try and avoid deliverables. Now that might sound slimy or kind of like I'm trying to get out of work, right? Like, and that's really not it at all. What I'm really just saying is let's try and figure out what the kernel of value is going to be from that deliverable that you just asked for. And let's try and do that. And let's try and do that quickly, right? So that we can keep this kind of nimble working relationship, so that I can keep my value concrete, and importantly, so that I don't like die from overwork, right? And so it's kind of this realization that Kronos and Kairos, this perspective, helps you both do better work, I think, but it also keeps you sane as an independent consultant, gives you much better control of your time. And that's really one of the number one complaints that I think a lot of independent consultants have, is just as soon as you have 2, 3, 4 clients, you just feel like your headspace is a mess, right? Like your ability to kind of hold those projects at once and work on them all at once is just ruined, right? And so this philosophy and this approach is how I've become good at dealing with a number of clients at once. Now, I'm still not working with a lot of clients at once. I think that's just a terrible idea generally. But I can certainly, when I need to, spin up to 3, 4, 5 clients all at once. So that's kind of the philosophy behind it. And then I wrote it up in this kind of Kronos and Kairos piece with a kind of awkward Greek framing, because that's kind of what I like to do on my blog. But people seem to like it.
I know it just made a load of sense to me. And like when you're in the consulting game, you look at this, and you're like, well, okay, that just you start to see the problems you're having and reflect on your own life and your own business problems sometimes, through that lens. And once you're aware of it, you can then start to make some changes with it. And I think some of the journey I'd already been on in that. I've vividly remember the first strategy that I ever presented to a client years ago when I worked at the Tomorrow Lab. Myself and Niall Toner put it together. I can't remember if it was 64 or 72 pages long, but it was one of the two. And the only thing I remember is halfway through the meeting, it looked like the guy we were presenting to had either fallen asleep or died. I'm still not sure if he's ever recovered from that. But that, you might imagine the time that went into that document. It was so much, and no one got any value from it at all. Nobody at all. And most of the stuff I present now, although I feel like I have to justify myself in the preamble when we're starting to work together, like, look, if you're expecting hundreds of pages, you're in the wrong place. 3, 4, 5, maybe 10, depending on what we get into. If there's a lot of charts, that's about it. That's all you're going to get. And by scaling down the deliverables a little bit, I think was my way of trying to handle that. But I read the post thinking, oh yeah, I can start to, maybe I need to rejig this and get to that value bit first. And there was a lot of really good takeaways to it, which took me into reading a load of your other posts as well.
Well, that's great. I appreciate it.
Excuse me. But I think what I liked about the blog is that it had mixed real life experience with a really lovely writing style. I feel like I'm flirting with you now, Tom. I'm not, I promise you. And really sort of takeaways that you didn't necessarily have to be an independent consultant. I think if you work with consultants, or even if you're in a mid-manager role as well, where I always think mid-management is one of the most difficult things to do in any organization, because you're stuck between trying to run a team but still having to deliver loads of the work yourself, quite a hands-on basis. So I just thought there was loads of takeaways for lots of people in different businesses with that could be useful for them. Yeah,
I mean, that's kind of the I guess the kind of dirty secret. A lot of my writing is I'm giving it this kind of independent consulting frame, but it's really, it's valuable for a lot of different folks, I think. And the things that I talk about, I really nerd out about kind of organizational politics and this fundamental idea of how do you actually get things done, right? And I think that's totally true whether you're a consultant or whether you're working full time inside an organization. Just navigating this idea of like, who holds the power around here, and how do decisions get made? And how do I get my ideas into the room where the decisions are made? And then how do I get people who are making the decisions to care about my ideas? And how do I get them on my side? It's just this, that's a multi-month kind of campaign of information gathering and politics and that stuff. I really enjoy that. I actually enjoy that kind of side of work. But I also think that it's just important. Like, you have to have an appreciation for that, because otherwise your projects are just not going to go anywhere, right? You're going to have these things that look nice or sound nice or kind of get greenlit, but then the budget never materializes, or they get greenlit and then they get shut down a few months later, right? Like, you've always got to be thinking about like, who are the ultimate stakeholders here, and what do they really care about, and how do I make sure that I'm working on a thing that they really care about? Because otherwise, what are we doing? Yeah. Now, my top tip, not that you want it, but I'll give you my top tip for the day. Please. I having never smoked in my life ever. My top tip when I'm consulting is I always go to the smoking shelter and spend time there, because that is where you get the truth. That is where you find out who pulls the levers of power in that organization. It's where you find out who's about to be sacked, who's going to get promoted. In the smoking shelters, where the loose talking happen. Loose lips sink ships. No, loose lips happen in the smoking shelter. That's what happens. Yeah, I actually, I've always known that to be true. Kind of those kind of informal situations and environments, but especially during the pandemic, it was really clear to me. It was like trying to do a consulting engagement without access to the smoking shelter. And, I mean, kind of theoretical. Whatever the smoking shelter. Right. The water cooler, whatever you want to call it. Trying to do a consulting gig without access to those things was much harder, right? Because the problem is that when you're doing a consulting engagement, the client never deliberately and explicitly pays you for doing that stuff of like navigating the organization, sense making, figuring out where the power lies, and so on, right? That's never a line item in the SOW, right? Like, and we're going to pay you $5,000 for just figuring out who runs the ship. That has never happened. But it's important. If you don't figure out who runs a ship, then you're toast. And doing that over Zoom and in Slack is much harder than doing it in person when you're sat in the office, right? And you can see things like, oh, everyone just came out of a meeting with that person and they all look unhappy. Like, something is going on over there. Who are those people and who's that person? And just especially trying to get that kind of rapid sense making, right? Trying to go from, I've never heard of this organization, I don't know anything about them, to I'm sat in their office and I'm rapidly trying to figure out how the company works, what the process is, what the formal process is and what the informal process is, who's doing what, who controls which part of the business. That stuff is just so much easier sat in the office. So I'm much as I'm glad that I get to work from home and Zoom exists and everything is possible remotely. One day I would love to get back to just sitting in offices. Yeah, being in there and drinking the coffee and finding out what happens is very, very important. But that takes us, I suppose, onto your other writing project, if we want to call it that, which is the SEO MBA that you've just put together. And you noticed a problem that I think even most SEOs noticed, that either
people don't tend to listen to them at a senior level, often multiplied by the fact that a lot of SEOs don't actually like talking to people generally, unless they're other SEOs in dark rooms and dark corners. I'm being about caricaturing a little bit here, but that SEO is really crucially important for many businesses and in terms of lifetime value and delivering ongoing revenue and things like that, but rarely gets a discussion or a seat at a strategic table. You identified a problem and then put a solution together. So do you want to talk to us about that?
Yeah, so you kind of nailed it with the positioning, really. The SEO MBA started as an email newsletter, and then I just launched the first flagship course as a course on executive presence, which just went live a couple of weeks ago. And it is to teach exactly what you just described, which is this kind of business and leadership skills for SEO professionals. And, you know, I think what's difficult for SEO professionals is, nobody teaches you this stuff, right? So this is all tacit knowledge that most people only learn by accidentally having a good boss, right? So if you happen to have had a good boss at some point who's good at this stuff, you can pick it up by kind of sitting next to them, watching how they work and so on. But unless you've had that experience, there's really no way to learn it, right? The blogs and the industry forums and stuff, everyone's talking about the kind of the practitioner level work, right? The tactical skills and how to do SEO, technical analysis, keywords, content. And don't get me wrong, all that stuff is important. You got to learn that stuff. You got to know how to do the job. But once you get to a certain level, you start to realize that doing the job is only one part of success, right? Actually getting things done, getting budget and buy-in and you know, getting stakeholders to pay attention is really important. And so that's really where I kind of try to focus my both the email and the course is on trying to teach that piece of the puzzle. And you know, I think SEOs in particular also get hamstrung because the SEO function inside an organization is often this kind of like dangling little unit that isn't quite in marketing, isn't quite in product, isn't quite in content, right? It's kind of like it might be quote unquote in the product org, but you're kind of off to the side, right? Or you might be in the marketing org, but you're kind of off to the side, right? And it's very, very common to have a very small SEO team, right? Maybe even one person without any resources and without any real leadership trying to get things done, right? And the problem is you don't have anyone to talk, you don't have like an advocate, right? You don't have a chief product officer who's going to be friendly to you and is going to coach you and tell you how it works and so on. And so I'm really on a kind of mission to empower SEO professionals to advocate for themselves better, to connect what they're working on to what the business actually cares about, right? Which is both, on the one hand, things like revenue, right? Like how are we doing value, but also what do they care about strategically? So paying attention to what is the organization really interested in right now? How do we align what are otherwise kind of generic SEO tasks to what the company really wants to work on, what the mission is, and so on. And so, yeah, I've been on this kind of mission. You know, I started the newsletter at the start of the year, and I kind of knew that it was a thing that was important in the industry. Like I knew it was a thing that was a kind of skills gap. I think I underestimated how much of an appetite there was for it. Like the success of the newsletter in particular has been really amazing and just kind of heartwarming. You know, the number of people who've come out and just really enjoyed it and read it and shared it has been wonderful. So that's really encouraged me and kept me going. And then the course that just went live a couple of weeks ago has likewise just been really great. So it's so nice to see people going through it, feeling like it's actually impacting their day to day. Right, that's the most rewarding thing for me putting it together is, you know, seeing somebody who went through one of the early kind of beta courses back in April, coming back around and being like, here's a screenshot of an email that I sent to my client. And the language that I'm using is a language that I learned in the SEO MBA course. And like, that's just like, I'm like crying over here, right? Like that's the thing that really kind of brings me to life is watching people feel like they can take this stuff, gain confidence from it, but also directly apply it to their work. Has just been really nice to see.
And it's like you say, difficult to move from being in any line of work, moving from sort of practitioner or, you know, technical on the tools effectively and learning that executive presence or how to influence. And my top tip again I worked with an agency actually who, as a side project to what we were doing, said, would you have a look at our reports? Because we don't seem to ever get any good feedback on them. And again, they were pages and pages and reams long. I was like, honestly, I'd do a test, right? Send the next report and just put 40 pages in the middle with just bullshit written on it, right? Nothing, just copy and paste Lorem Ipsum text. See if anybody notices, because the only thing I know about these reports is nobody's reading them, right? So just start with a revenue signal sign at the top of the page, put a couple of other key metrics underneath, send it across and say, what else would you like to know? And I bet nobody says anything. People go, brilliant, thanks for that report. I'm going to put it in my board pack. Job done.
Totally. Yeah. Well, and I think what you just said there as well is, so important is that we forget how much of our work. So we put a lot of detail and effort into our work, but we forget how often our work needs to be designed to be reshared inside an organization, right? It's going to happen whether we like it or not, and so we should design for it so it happens in the right way. Which is, a client is going to take a screenshot of one of our slides in our presentation and put it in their board pack, like you said, right? Or they're going to take it and they're going to email it to their boss, right? And people inside organizations, people are always trying to, trim, summarize, pare down, get to the key points, and then re-socialize it to the key stakeholders. And if you let the client do that, especially for something like SEO, which is kind of technical in nature and can often be complex or detailed, like hard to grasp, right? If you let the client do that reformulation, you're going to end up in a situation where they're going to be like, wait, we've got the budget to work on the thing. And you're like, that's not the thing that I want. Yeah, that isn't what I said. So you got to pay attention to is the work that you're making designed to be reshared? And I talk about, I have a love for putting presentations together. I kind of I just completely nerd out on good presentations. And one of the things that I just absolutely am a huge stickler for is an executive summary. An executive summary which is not a table of contents, right? So not an executive summary which is, this report contains the following 17 items. It's no, an executive summary it's a compression of the whole thing into 5 slides at the front. And you go through those, and if you read those 5 slides, you have content. You know everything you need to know about the whole of the idea, right? The whole shape of it, from what is the situation, what are we asking for, what are we going to get out of it, what are the next steps? Great, good.
Yeah.
And the point of this is a number of things are benefited, but in particular, that idea of, great, so those 5 slides are the thing that you copy and paste and send to the CEO. Right? Those 5 slides are the things you copy and paste and put in the board deck, right? It's a very deliberate sense of you can just I've done the compression for you so that you can both accurately represent the work, but also just save time and just present it upwards to the CEO or sideways to the chief product officer, whoever it might be. And then you can have the rest of the presentation, contain more details, right? It's not about hiding stuff, but that executive summary I hate seeing presentations that just don't get to the point until slide 35, and you're just like, what are you doing? Well, no, everyone's asleep. No one cares.
Presentations that are made like TV ads where you tell the story and there's a reveal at the end, and it's that works in university when you had a 20-minute presentation to make to give to the lecturer, but not when you've got someone's attention who is really, really busy, doesn't care what you do often. They just they only care about one thing, which is something they've got to do tomorrow or a presentation they've got to make. So yeah.
And in the SEO industry in particular, I think one of the bad things is that the kinds of presentations that you see all the time are from conferences. And conference presentations are a radically different beast than business presentations, right? A conference presentation is it should be visual, and it should have this story, and it can do what you just said of it can build to a point, right? It can have this beginning and a middle and an end, and you try and do that in a business sense, and the CEO is like, okay, but I'm going to stop you at slide 2 and say, what are we looking at, and what is the point? And you're like, and I've been in the room when this happens, and the person is like, should I just skip to the end? But I've got a bunch of good slides in the middle. What do I do now? I don't, I don't know. It's and I have a lot of empathy, right? And so again, the SEO MBA exists because I've been in those situations and I've seen those things go wrong, and I've done it wrong myself, and I've seen how I actually learned a lot of this from my brother, right? He kind of taught me a lot of these good skills fundamentally, and I've seen how much of a difference it makes. And there's just nowhere else to learn this stuff, right? That was the big aha moment for me. It was just no one else is really talking about this, specifically for the SEO industry. Again, this is kind of the stuff that really needs to exist. So yeah, that's why I'm here.
So I think I missed singing the theme tune. There's a top tip theme tune, which I often sing when there's a top tip coming along. Now, you've already given us the top tip about executive summary at the beginning of a presentation. I feel it would be remiss for me to not sing the TOPTIP theme tune just before we move on. So I've always liked to shoehorn it in there. In terms of the SEO MBA, getting back to the serious part of the discussion, so who's it for then? Is it kind of people who've been in the industry a couple of years and are moving up? Is it for people who are already senior execs in the industry? A little bit of everybody? What's your sort of mental customer that you're thinking of?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's for anyone who has is leveling out of practitioner, right? So anyone who knows how to do SEO on some level, right? They've done figured out the skills, and they're starting to encounter situations where getting budget and buy-in are important, right? So when you're more junior, whether you're in-house or an agency, other people kind of take care of that for you, right? Like you do the work and you kind of hand it on to other folks, and then somebody else figures out how to get the budget. Somebody else figures out how to get it done. You're really kind of like an analyst level, or you're like in the weeds. But as soon as you level out of that, as soon as you start going up the chain, so whether that starts to become a manager, or whether just more senior, or whether you start working at a larger organization, and really honestly, like anyone who is interfacing with clients, right? So as soon as you get to that client interface level at the agency side, I feel like all of these skills become useful, right? And then you know, on the other hand, I think it's useful for all the way up to you know, agency owners, senior directors. I've had folks come through the course like at CMO level and really enjoyed it. You know, I think that again, if you haven't had this kind of training, even if you think you know a lot of the stuff, it can be a great grounding of like, okay, but there's an actual framework in place, right? Like a lot of people have learned this stuff through kind of trial and error and instinct, right? Like people have kind of, you know, been successful in their career by having had to figure this stuff out along the way, but not realizing that there's a bunch of actual kind of like frameworks and theory and like structure that you can use for this, right? So one of the big aha moments for me was like the SCQA kind of template, right? So that stands for situation, complication, question, and answer. And this is part of the pyramid principle, which is a book written by Barbara Minto, who used to work at McKinsey. And this is a whole book about how to do exactly what I just described, about structuring an argument, right? A logical structure, about putting the most important things first, right? About having a rule of three. So you're like, each time you're kind of like laddering up with this kind of progressive, like we've got three things, each of those things has three things underneath it, right? And you know, even for me, where I felt like I was getting good at making presentations and pretty good at this stuff, when I encountered the SCQA kind of framework a couple of years ago, my mind was blown, because I was like, oh, right, this is a thing that actually has like theory behind it, and people have kind of already been down this path. This isn't something that I've had to, like, I'm not the only one in the world who's had to figure this out, right? And so I feel like this is a rambling way of saying, you know, even more senior folks, I think, can sometimes get value from this stuff, even if they kind of know some of this stuff, even if they think they're doing it. Just having that reassurance of like, actually, there is a framework here, and there are things you can learn that will be more like process to follow, rather than just winging it every time, right? Which I think is, again, what a lot of folks are left to do. You know, again, especially in the SEO industry, where you're just, even senior folks are like the single senior SEO dangling off the side of the whole product org, right? There's like 200 people in the product org, you know, like the one SEO person, and you kind of don't really have any people reporting to you. You don't really know who you report to. And it's just like a very common situation, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think I like the fact that it's. I hate the phrase soft skills. It almost sort of devalues probably the most important parts of what we do, like with people, working with people. And if you can't make people work with you and for you and around you, then everything falls to pieces. So I hate the word soft skills, but it always strikes me when you ask people, what training do you want for your job? They immediately go and think practical, on the tool skills. You know, if you asked any SEOs what training would they like, they'd probably want to do a technical SEO course, or they'd want to do a content course, or they'd want to do something like that, or how to use this product better or that product better, or they want to go to a conference. And just for that sort of moment of waking up and realizing, oh, actually, this is what I need to, you know, to be better at my job, is how to influence people better, feels like a really important step for the whole SEO industry, and probably more than just the SEO industry, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I mean, so part of the problem, I think, is that when you're not getting what you want, right? So you're not getting your budgets implemented. So you're not getting budgets, you're not getting projects implemented, you're not getting buy-in, you're just facing resistance, right? I think what you think is that you're not putting a good enough strategy together, right? So you're not working hard enough on the content strategy is not good enough, or the technical audit is not correct enough, right? So you're instantly trying to look at the things in front of you, right? Which is where you can see feedback, and you can get mastery over technical audit, you can get mastery over content strategy, right? The problem is, and like you described, soft skills is not a great word for it, but the problem is that the stuff that goes wrong is mostly invisible, right? And the problem there is that when people say no, you have no context for why, right? And this is especially bad because most organizations have middle management and even senior management who really suck at providing context, right? So you'll go and you'll say, I have an SEO strategy and I want to put it together and I want to do all these things. And your boss, trying to be nice, will be like, okay, I'll try and go get some budget for you. And they kind of go off into the woods, right, somewhere. And then they come back and they were like, I didn't really get any budget for you. Sorry, I tried really hard. Your strategy was really good. You know, really, like, it was really, next year, we'll do it next year, right? And the problem is that it's kind of invisible of like what happened, right? Where did it go wrong, right? And so the only thing you have to look at is, well, I wish I'd done a better strategy, right? I wish the thing that I'd given to my boss should have been better, right? Instead, it's like, oh, maybe actually it should have been more convincing, right? Or maybe I should have figured out who the stakeholders were and made it relevant to what they care about, right? So it's like actually not that much needed to change of what the actual strategy was you put together. It was more about how you position it for the right relevant stakeholders, how you position it as being relevant for the organization. And also, then there's also just a fundamental thing of like making the numbers, A, be revenue numbers, and B, making them bigger, right? It's like the SEO industry has been trained for like 2 decades now to look at monthly numbers, right? Like it goes all the way back to like the AdWords keyword tool from like way back in the day, right? And it's like everything is like, this keyword has this number of searches a month. And so everything the SEO industry puts together is like, this is how many searches we're going to get a month. And every business operates on, this is how much revenue we're going to make a year. And like it's the huge disconnect. It's like just times your numbers by 12, right? It'll instantly make them more interesting and more compelling. And that sounds like a cheat, but it's actually, and especially in the SEO space, it actually more closely aligns the time frame for which results are going to appear, right? You times the number by 12, actually SEO has this wonderful compounding effect. You don't have to reinvest in it every single month, right? It is kind of, you set it and you get these results. So why shouldn't we look at results over 12, if not 24 months, right? And when you do that, suddenly you get to this point where it's like, I can look at this revenue, and now you've got people paying attention, right? Because now senior stakeholders like that revenue sounds meaningful. That sounds interesting. Let's have a look at what's it going to take to get that revenue, right? And now you have a seat at the table, et cetera, et cetera. So again, long rambling answer to your question, but soft skills is a terrible way to position it. And I think I would almost, I don't know if this is the right framing, but it's almost like hidden skills, right? Like I said, it's like the things that go wrong are invisible to you. And that means that you can't see how to get better at them, and you can't see, you don't get that feedback loop, like I said. So.
Yeah, and I think there's some fascinating points in there, and I like the numbers one. And I think SEOs, when I've seen SEO reports and when I've sort of seen them either from client side or agency side and various times of things, the other thing that always strikes me about SEO numbers is that there's so much science and certainty into putting them together that they somehow, but when you look at them on a bit of paper, they almost always seem completely unbelievable as well. And I don't, they either seem like we're going to put all this effort in for this fractional return, or they always seem to quote like, and if you do this, we'll get 1,012% return. You're like, how can either of those things be true? I really just don't understand it. And I know maybe totally. when you're enterprise level, maybe those gaps close a little bit. But as companies are in that sort of mid space, it always seems to be someone predicting like a 2,000% rise in revenue if we did this one thing. Like, I don't know if anyone's going to buy that.
Yeah, totally. There's a lot of the problem with like forecasting and modeling is that so much of it is just made up, right? But the magic of it to do it well is to choose to make it up in a way that is credible and believable, right? It's kind of like you have to choose a compelling and convincing frame, not just make up like 1,000%. Like there's this idea that, well, if we make it 1,000% return, how could they not say yes to it? And instead, you shot yourself in the foot because the CEO looks at it as like 1,000% return. Get out of here.
Whatever.
Nothing. You don't get 1,000% return on things, right? So it's about choosing that frame, which is compelling, but not wildly out of the realm of question. I also think that a big mistake that SEO folk make, and I think this is true in all kinds of other strategies too, is you only look at the upside without really understanding what goes in to make it happen, right? So a great example for SEO is if we only made content about these 200 keywords, we'd get 400,000 visits a month in return. And you're like, okay, but that was 200 keywords. That's 200 pages of content. We're looking at, $300 per page. And that's 200 pieces of content. So we probably want like an editor as well. So, and we're also talking about putting this on a new site section. So we might need like a CMS. Like you actually have to like think about what it's going to take, right? And this is another way that you get thrown out of the boardroom or the kind of the C-suite is when you're more junior, you can kind of only look at the upside, right? It's like somebody else's job to kind of figure out how it all comes together. And you're really just like spotting the opportunity. As you get more senior, you can't get away with that, right? You can't go and present a strategy to the CEO, which is looking at making all this content. And the CEO is like, well, what do you need to make all that content? And you're like, a writer, I guess. And you're like, and the CEO's like, get out of here. Like, no, what do you need? You need like an editor, you need a writer, you're talking about 200 pieces of content, we need some kind of CMS. We got like, you go down the list of like all the things we actually need to get it done, right? And that's another way that I think SEO folks fall down. I have a lot of empathy as well, because this is a direct consequence of the SEO person, right? Come back to this idea of like the SEO person being sat like off to the side of the product org. Sometimes it's really hard for you to understand what it's going to take, right? Because the product org is like, don't bother me. Don't bother me about US. You go sit in your closet, right? And don't bother me. And so it can be hard to go around the organization and be like, what would it take for us to make 200 pieces of content? What would we need? How much would it cost? Like what team would get it done? And so again, you're back now to what we were just talking about with soft skills, which is like, navigating the organization, making friends inside the organization, being able to talk to these other teams, being able to talk about your work so they care about it. All those things are really important.
I think that the phrase I've been using with clients recently is ambitiously realistic, in that I know certainly a lot of the companies I'm working with, and you'll probably still keep in touch with the news from here, is that recruitment is a real challenge for everyone at the minute. There's a twin kind of crunch of Brexit stopping some workers coming in who probably would have come previously, along with rising salaries going in other places and people throwing money around. And there's kind of this pressure on recruitment in lots of different sectors. And there's a couple of clients I've been working with recently where it's been a real challenge for them. And for a couple of reasons, they can't outsource some of the work that they might be needing. And, we've looked at this, and as part of the working with the board on the strategy that we've developed, sort of having those conversations and going, look, if you could get more people, we could probably suggest something different, but you can't make this happen. And we can either suggest something that then becomes has a dependency, and a dependency that you're not entirely sure when you can solve people, or we can be ambitiously realistic, which is, okay, let's go for this level instead of going for what might put a couple of million on turnover. We might just have to look at something that might only put 1 million or 500,000 on turnover, but we can achieve it and we can bring it to life now. And that realism actually buys you a lot of friends. People, oh yeah, this is, we've bought someone who knows what they're doing here, rather than here's 1,000% growth that you can get. Oh, geez, here it goes again, dreaming marketing fella.
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, I don't think you realize how those conversations go unless you've been in the room with kind of senior executive, but having that credibility of being able to say, I actually have an appreciation for how this is actually going to get done, right? Like not just the abstracts, but like what teams do we need? What processes do we need? Do we need to hire? What are the practicalities of hiring? How do we find these people? Like, yeah, absolutely. All of that stuff just makes you seem more valuable, right, to have around, by talking about the practicalities, by bringing it back to reality, by talking about timelines and roadblocks and trying to adapt to the reality of the situation. Yeah, 1,000%. I feel like when I put a strategy together for a client now, it's like 20% figuring out what to do, and then 80% of the time figuring out how we're going to get it done, right? And your classic case for this is, I come along and I say, oh, you haven't really invested in the front end of the website. So there's a ton of like SEO, conversion, and content gains that we can have if we invest in the front end of the website. But like, how are we going to do that? Like, your product team is focused on shipping the app, right? So like, what do we do? Do we bring in an external team? Can we bring in an external team, right? Like, can we get an external product team to plug into your architecture or not, right? Like, that's like a yes or no. Can we work with an agency? Can we hire more developers? How do we get that done? And yeah, again, like you said, it's like, you can't present the revenue forecast until you've had an appreciation for what we're going to do, right? It's like these two things are connected, right? It's like, until you have the resources, you can't get anything done. It's not going to happen, yeah. Right? So you got to think about these two things in lockstep, which again is all the way back to strategy and stewardship, right? Then it becomes this like, well, we have an abstract strategy, but how do we translate it into reality, right? And how do we make sure that as we're translating it into reality, we're doing it in the right way? So a good example from my own work is I love to get involved in hiring, right? So again, my strategy says you should invest in SEO, and they say, okay, we should hire an SEO director. And I say, great, let me come in and help run that search, be a part of the interviews and so on. And the great thing about that is I can then make sure that we're hiring somebody who's going to be a good fit for the strategy. Right? Like, again, SEO director can mean all kinds of things, right? You can hire people from an agency background, in-house background, different, people can lean technical, they can lead towards content. And if you don't have good SEO expertise already in the organization, you're going to be terrible at hiring for and vetting an SEO director, right? And so that's this stewardship piece as well. Is like, okay, we have the strategy, but the practicalities really matter, right? Let's go and hire the right person for the job. And I should stick around for that. I can help with that, right? So I'm going to roll up my sleeves and I'm going to get in the weeds, and we're going to do this together.
involved in that. And how does the brand Tom Critchlow, I mean, it's inseparable from the man, obviously, but with your background in SEO, and then you've been into sort of brand marketing as in the time at Google and into independent consultancy. And I know from reading some of your writing that you still get the emails or the requests going, oh, hi, we've got this SEO project. Would you come and have a look at it? How have you sort of positioning the brand of Tom as you are? How have you managed to focus on what sort of projects do you look at for the consulting business? And have you looked at any challenges that launching an SEO product, your MBA, might cause to that in terms of maybe does it take a couple of years back from where you were before? Have you spent all this time getting out of the SEO game, so to speak, and now it's like, oh, Tom just does SEO again. Do you worry it'll pull you back? Did you think about branding it differently, or what was the thought process?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like you've seen into my soul. This is so there's kind of two things, two ways to answer that question. One is your self-identity as an independent worker is one of the most challenging pieces of work that you will do, or at least for me, I found it one of the most challenging pieces of work. Is not necessarily like positioning or branding in the sense of like how do I describe this work to others and what do they care about, but how do I describe my work to others in a way that I care about? How do I create a label for who I am and what I do that I can feel confident in and not feel like a schmuck, or not feel like it doesn't really suit me, or that it's like slimy or whatever, right? Like identity and labels are really important. And when you work at a job, those things get given to you, right? When you work for yourself, there's no one around to help, right? And by the way, you also never get a promotion, you never get a change of job title, and so on. So you don't get any awards, right? Like, so all this stuff is identity is a big thing as an independent worker. And I have been very, very deliberate, and I've worked very hard over the last 7 years to not just be an SEO person, right? Like you said, it's like I very deliberately tried to do more than just SEO, and to work in a broader set of things, and to have a broader set of skill sets, and to work at senior levels of business, and so on and so forth. And yes, launching the SEO MBA, I was worried when I did it, that I was like, oh, this is kind of a step back into the SEO industry, right? And this is a step back into Tom being the SEO guy. And I definitely worried about that. And that has also definitely happened to a certain degree, right? I've had more SEO leads, and I've had more conversations with SEO folks, and I've been back in the industry throughout this year. So I think on the one hand, that has been maybe like a small step backwards, or a kind of thing that hasn't been what I wanted. But I have definitely like offset this by launching into training and education, right? So the flip side to that is, and I wrote a post about this, the Jigsaw of Independence on my blog, about independent consulting and about where you draw energy from, right? What are the things that bring you to life, right? What are the things that really make you feel alive and feel valuable to you and meaningful? And as an independent consultant, right, you don't have to have all of those things from one thing, right? I basically have like 5 or 6 jobs at any one time, right? I have this client work, that client work, I have my blog that I'm writing, I have this thing that I'm doing, and I can get different pieces of kind of meaning and value and energy from those things depending on what they are. And when I did an exercise to kind of map out where I draw value from, training and coaching people was a thing that has been deeply valuable to me every time I've done it, even all the way back to when I opened the New York office for Distilled. It's still one of the most valuable things that I did in my career, was like, you're hiring a small team of juniors, managing them, training them, watching them grow, watching them flourish, creating an environment where they can kind of become themselves, and watching what they've gone on to do now. It still is like one of the most rewarding things that I've done, right? But over the last 7 years, I've done very little of that, right? I haven't had a team. I very deliberately not started an agency and not hired people. And so the SEO MBA kind of neatly fit this kind of key thing that was missing. Was I really want to teach people, I really want to help people and coach people, I want to help people, I want to see people get better jobs, I want to see people get pay rises, I want to see people be more confident in their work, and I wasn't really doing that as a consultant. And so the SEO MBA kind of fits this big hole. So this is a very, kind of maybe more than you bargained for when you asked the question, but it's like there's this kind of mental accounting of my identity, right? And the identity is made up of a number of different projects and things. And yes, on the one hand, the SEO MBA has kind of brought me back into the SEO fold a little bit. But on the other hand, it's been this just deeply valuable and rewarding thing, and kind of meaningful thing for me this whole year of, oh, great, I finally get to scratch this itch, right? I finally get to do this thing again that I find really valuable. And, I hope that the SEO MBA is kind of positioned in a way that I'm not kind of like back in it in a sense, right?
Can you do the keyword research for us, Tom?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Hopefully I'm not doing too much of that. But yeah, I mean, it's also, I should also have an appreciation for it. Like, even though I've talked a good game about kind of doing more than just SEO, a lot of my client work over the last 7 years has still touched on SEO, right? I've still done keyword research. I've still done content strategy. I've still done all of these pieces that you might expect in various points. I've done other things as well, but I can't pretend that it doesn't exist and that I'm not doing it. So all of that is to say, yes, the SEO MBA is that, but on the flip side is now the course is out. I'm really hoping to get my book off the ground. So the blog posts that we were talking about are all part of a book project, and it's a book aimed at independent consultants in particular. So it has nothing specifically to do with SEO, but it's just about independent consulting. And I'm hoping to get that kind of like wrapped up and squared away and published kind of beginning of next year, and have a bit more time to work on that now the course is up.
Excellent. And look, I think I've said this in the last 3 or 4 episodes. I have nothing but respect for people who write books and ship them and deliver them. I have a book on marketing strategy, which is somewhere between 50 and 60% written. But if you asked me 3 years ago when I started writing it, it probably got to 45% written in the first 3 weeks. And 4 years later, I've added 10%-ish to it. So, it may never be written. It probably will never be written, but my aim is at some point to do it. So I have nothing but respect for people who can get it out and get it shipped. So do let us know when that comes out, because we can, certainly promo it on the show and share it on the socials as well.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's, I didn't actually set out to write a book, at least not in the very early days. I just set out to do some writing, right? Put it on my blog. And it kind of became a thing where I was like, oh, this could be a book-shaped object. But I've written the whole thing on my site, which I just, again, has been, but because it's taken, 3 or 4 years to get this far, to be able to have had feedback on the writing along the way, the fact that we're even talking about some of the contents of the book, just gets out there, has kept me going, right? That's the thing that is like, I've gotten feedback along the way, and it's kept me alive. It also means that when the book comes out, it'll be a hard sell, because I'll be like, it's all free on the website, but you can buy the book too. All
you need to do is just go back to the pages, delete the sort of bottom 80% of it, and then just use it as and buy the book. I'd have buy now button.
I don't think you can delete things off the internet, Andy. That's not how it works.
Really? I don't know. You can ask a few
I hate to break it to you. But yeah.
Damn it. Ask a few sports stars and see. No, they'll tell you can't delete anything. Anyway, while we're on the subject of books, and when we're coming towards the end of the discussion, what books you've mentioned a couple of books, but what would you recommend people dive into and read for improving their marketing or consulting or whatever, or even just any books that you've really enjoyed recently?
Yeah, I'm not like a huge nonfiction reader, so I don't have a ton of those kind of like recommendations at hand. There's obviously the kind of the traditional strategy books and et cetera, et cetera. A client of mine is really trying to get me to read 7 Powers right now, which I know is kind of like this big classic and I think has a lot of value, but I'll be honest, I haven't actually read that. I've read them. I've read the notes. I probably make another shill for the Helsinki Design Lab. So they have a number of books. There's Recipes for Systemic Change and another one that I'm blanking on the name of, but they're both free online, so you can download the PDFs, or you can actually kind of print on demand, I think, to kind of buy them in book format. But the Helsinki Design Lab, those books have been a big influence on me. So I probably recommend those.
Brilliant stuff. Brilliant. And I suppose the question I finish up with everybody as well is, what one question were you expecting me to ask today that I haven't asked?
Oh, we covered so many different topics that I wanted to talk about, and we talked about the blog and everything, which is great. I don't know. I don't know if I have a good answer to that.
It is mainly because I'm a superb interviewer and make sure that we cover everything. I know that, but let's share that with everyone.
And I hope your audience knows that too by now. And
both people listening to the show absolutely do know that. Hi, Mum. Hi, Dad.
Here's a question that I've been asked a little bit recently. Maybe it was kind of self-serving, but everyone is asking me when the next course is happening. Everyone's like, "All right, you launched a course. When's the next one coming?" And I don't have a very satisfying answer, which is like,
after the book.
So the book first, and then maybe another course. Putting this one together was a ton of work. I'm kind of letting the dust settle on it a little bit. I do think there are some definite ways to kind of branch out under the SEO MBA brand and turn that into more of a brand, right? And put more courses under it. Maybe even have courses from other folks under that SEO MBA label as well. It's all potentially on the roadmap, but none of that is for today's decision. I'm gonna keep kind of ride this course and play that out for a little while further. I've got a lot of work to do, just doing that, and then we'll see where it goes.
It is amazing how there is this natural focus on what's next sometimes for people, I'll give you two examples of that. I live in Northern Ireland, so just outside Belfast. Whenever people come to stay, the locals have this wonderful question, like literally someone's just stepped off the plane and we'll meet them in a pub and they'll be like, oh, lovely to see you, when are you leaving? And it, like, well, I just got here. Thanks for that. And my second example, I got engaged recently. So Kat and I got engaged. And literally, the moment the word congratulations is, once you get to the S of the congratulations, it's then followed quickly by, and when's the wedding? I'm like, I only asked her like literally 12 minutes ago. Give us a chance, but it's like, can we not just celebrate the now, just for a moment? And then we'll talk about the next. Let's just celebrate now. So I'm not even going to ask you when your next course is out. I'm just going to celebrate that you've got one out already. So well played, Tom.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
Brilliant stuff. Well, look, enough of my ramblings about all sorts of stuff. Tom Critchlow, thank you very much for joining us on the show. Don't forget you can check out the SEO MBA, his blog, and all the other bits we mentioned. Check it in the show notes. And we'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us, Tom.
Thanks so much, Andy. This was really great. I really enjoyed it.